Today on Media Mola, the podcast where we dive into the future of media with a focus on monetization and growth. We'll be talking about monetization strategies for publishers. I'm very pleased to welcome Simon Owens. Hello, Simon, and thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. You have interviewed more than 1,000 media entrepreneurs and operators. You have a newsletter covering the media industry of what's happening in the US, and you're also really keen on covering the what I call the new media, the creator economy, and its impact on the industry. And right now, like we were discussing before clicking record, in general, it's a tough time for media, although there are exceptions. And since you have so many insights and knowledge about the industry, I'm sure it will be very helpful for my audience, the French publishers, to have your expertise on the topic of underrated and innovative monetization strategies for the publishers. Before we begin this episode, can you tell us a bit more about your journey and who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so I've kind of had a circuitous journey just because, I didn't like, growing up, like all this kind of new media was still forming. So it's not like you could, when I got out of college, it's not like there were any full-time independent journalists, or if there were, there weren't very many. So yeah, I just started blogging in college, graduated in 2006. Had no real job skills to speak of, but I had an English degree and had a blog. So I used those two things to get my first like newspaper job. So I became like a traditional newspaper journalist. And kind of just like worked and learned how to do reporting and moved in between both traditional media, but then also into marketing and PR and stuff. And the entire time I was, during my free time was continuing to blog and write about the media industry and everything like that. Basically in 2020, I was like a freelance content marketing consultant. So I was doing a lot of just helping companies like writing articles, blogs, social media, newsletters, and stuff like that, running their content strategies on a freelance self-employed basis. The pandemic happened and there was a big slowdown in client work because, a lot of companies didn't know how things were going to shake out. So they kind of put a pause on all my client work for a few months. So at that point, I had been running, a newsletter and podcast for several years, basically as kind of like a side project. And I decided to just jump into it full time. I launched paid subscriptions. And so, yeah, as you said, I run a newsletter that publishes twice a week. I have a podcast, and it just covers the intersection of tech and media. The tagline is for the podcast for how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. So I cover every aspect of that. I cover the traditional media companies like the New York Times and the Washington Post. I cover the creator economy, like the Mr. Beast, the Emma Chamberlains of the world. And then I cover the tech companies that facilitate, content distribution like YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, Threads, Twitter, all that kind of stuff as well.
Great, great. Before we dive into the underrated and innovative monetization strategy, can you tell us a bit more about the current state of publisher monetization? You were telling me before launching the recording of the podcast that you really focus on the US market, although you're keeping an eye on what's happening in Europe, mostly in the UK. But what's working in the US in terms of monetization for the different publishers that you're looking at? Is it display, affiliate, events, programmatic? Can you give us like the broad idea of the current state?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not display and programmatic. I think that's bit like publishers have always been weak on that because one, it just doesn't like they can't really outscale the tech companies, and then two, display and programmatic just doesn't like provide that much value to advertisers, and that's why advertisers really love advertising on Google and Facebook and because the native ads are like create so much more ROI than display ads. When people they have ad blindness, they don't like looking at ads, they don't click on them. When they do click on them, it's completely by accident. So I think programmatic advertising has always had diminishing returns and has never really been able to fund a robust media ecosystem. Where I'm seeing a lot of, publishers leaning into is things where they have more kind of direct control over their audience. So paid subscriptions obviously is a huge one. Not all publishers have succeeded with it because paid subscriptions are a really hard business to be in, but obviously companies like the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Atlantic have really succeeded on that front. Events is getting bigger and bigger every year because it's one thing that they can do that's highly differentiated from the tech companies. Like the tech companies, events don't scale in the way that tech companies want them to scale, so they're never going to bother like putting on like an annual, nurses association event and stuff like that. So, especially in the B2B space, a lot of them are doubling down in live events and creating kind of real in person experiences, which I think a lot of audiences get a lot of value with. And then, you know, there were a few years there where they were doubling down on e-commerce and affiliate, but I think they're starting to find that that's a lot harder business to be in. They thought they could just phone it in and they could outsource the creation of all this affiliate content. They can continue doing what they do normally with news gathering, and then this affiliate business will just start generating them passive income. But as they all flooded the zone, they started seeing diminishing returns, and also platforms like Google and Amazon noticed that they were creating like very low quality content, so they started to punish those publishers. And so you see a lot of publishers, just especially over the last like 6 months or so, kind of reeling as a lot of that affiliate revenue has dried up because they were basically just phoning it in. They weren't really devoted to it in the best affiliate publisher is probably Wirecutter, which is owned by the New York Times, and they're putting in 30 hours of research into every single product recommendation they're making, and most publishers weren't putting that amount of effort into it. And so now they're finding that it was kind of it wasn't the silver bullet that they thought would save the media industry.
All right. It's interesting your view on the affiliate and e-commerce play because in France it's still really popular and a lot of big publishers, they outsource as well the content to third-party agencies. And although we can say whatever we want about the quality of the content, I'm not sure Google will like it. And what's happening in the US ends up happening in Europe, first UK and then France, Germany, over the coming month. And I'm not particularly bullish on that play, although I must say affiliate marketing is still, when it's done well, is still a fantastic revenue model for publishers. So
Yeah,
you
so like it's great because it actually rewards publishers for driving revenue versus the display advertising, the programmatic advertising. Nobody's clicking on that and buying a product. So basically, publishers are like, okay, if you're going to judge us by how much direct revenue we're driving, then we should get credit for every single, we're going to do what we do best, which is creating content and use our content creation skills to recommend products and services. And then you're going to pay us, but it'll be a much clearer transaction. And so theoretically, it can be a great business for publishers. But there are also problems with affiliate. Like there's something called last click distribution. So trying to figure out which publisher should even get credit for driving that sale. You would think it'd be easy, but it's really not. I don't know if you saw these huge scandals
Mhm.
with PayPal and Capital One, that they were getting people to install these browser apps
Yes.
that were basically stealing affiliate revenue from publishers by taking away that last click attribution. So it's a hard business to be in still.
Mhm. But do you think that there is a way for publishers to do it well outside of the scope of like, okay, we buy a Wirecutter or a big established site and we give them all the resources to run independently? Or is there a way for big publishers to integrate affiliate without going into an acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they want to do it well, they need to lean into what they do best and not like phone it in. Don't just curate like audience reviews and stuff for products. Like you do some real reporting on products, and then utilize affiliate deals. I also see because attribution is so difficult, I think publishers should invest in building their own kind of e-commerce um, sites where the purchase is made on a site that's owned by the domain of the publisher. So that's a hard business to be in because people are going to be more hesitant to buy something from, NewYorkTimes.com versus Amazon.com where they have like an Amazon Prime account. But, if they can, I think they can get higher commissions though, because they are like solidifying attribution, saying, no, this was on our website. We get 100% credit for the sale. And so you need to pay us a higher commission. So I do think like more publishers should try to kind of build their own, basically what are called drop shipping sites, where maybe they're not actually handling the physically mailing the product to the customer, but
Mhm.
it's happening on a web, like the actual transaction is happening on a website that they own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It makes
Yeah.
sense. And I have a few example in mind, but not at a massive scale. Do you have in the US some example of big publishers that are doing to do e-com on their website and that is doing well?
Well, doing well is the qualifier. So, like off the top of my head, there's Hodinkee, which is a watch site, and they basically acquired their own kind of e-commerce site. Now, it turns out that they kind of overextended, and it wasn't doing as well as they
Okay.
thought it would be. So that's not a great case study for how to do it. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there what other publishers have created. I know like some like it's hard to know because a lot of these companies are private and aren't like built like actually breaking down their revenue streams to a super extent. So it's hard to know who's faking it and who's actually doing it. But like I think a lot of publishers are at least trying it. I don't know how successful
Sure.
it is. Like there's a publisher called Man of Many in Australia that's like a kind of consumer men's product type of website that made a lot of money through affiliate sales in its early years, and now it's launched its own basically online retail site where it's selling stuff more through that. But I don't know, how much more
Yeah.
profitable or successful it is than it's just kind of traditional affiliate sales.
Okay. Before
But even though I don't have good case studies of saying this has been successful, I think it makes intuitive sense why it would be more
mm,
successful given how competitive the landscape is like owning more of that distribution.
mm. It's tough because for media, the most promising ways to make money tomorrow basically we are asking them to do things that are completely outside of their original scope, which is reporting and creating news and creating content. We
Yeah.
are asking media to do e-com. We are asking media to do events, which is like a completely different business model.
Yeah.
But that's what's working. And so how would you advise media company transitioning into new business model without getting like overwhelmed or without getting like frustrated by the fact that the old business is not working anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, staying extremely lean and, not, I think a lot of media companies get too ahead of their skis and they invest a ton of money into a new kind of product category. And then they run out of revenue and they don't have leftover revenue to continue to iterate. So like if you're getting into events, don't launch a 3 day, travel destination conference to start with like 1 day summits or like small, events that happen in like a bar or something like that, where you can easily rent out the bar and before, because like some go all in and they're like, okay, we're gonna basically guarantee this hotel block to this hotel that we're going to spend x amount of money, and in order to do that we need to get 1,000 attendees to our conference. That's like a huge upfront risk. So like a lot of the publishers I see that are succeeding with like events is like they ease into it. They start with a 1 day summit or like a meetup or something like that, and then once they show they can get traction for that, then they turn it into a 2 day 3 day conference. They start expanding to new regions. So they start with wherever they're strongest, and then they start testing it out. Like if they're in the UK, they might start in London. But if
Mhm.
they have a lot of people in their industry, they're in San Francisco, then their next conference is in San Francisco. And then their next conference after that might be in Singapore. So it's just like slow, responsible expansion.
So would you say that the biggest mistake that you see media doing when they're trying to diversify revenues is like overextending and seeing things too big and being too ambitious instead of
Yeah.
staying lean?
I mean, that's certainly the lesson of the last 10 years and the 2010s. I don't know what was happening in France, but there was just like so much VC cash going into companies like BuzzFeed, Vice, Mike, Huffington Post, and stuff like that. And they were just they just had these huge cash burn rates because they were just investing in a million different things and not really stopping to say, okay, is there a product market fit here? Is there an actual real business model here? And then once that kind of bubble popped and all that VC cash, dried up, then they had had these huge cash expenditures and no business model to justify them.
Mhm. It was less in France to an extent, less VC money, but we followed, of course, what happened with BuzzFeed, and yeah, it was a lot of money for things that where media should have kept probably lean. But again, it's really tempting, I guess, for media because they were selling like and they were valued like a tech company where actually they were a media company. But actually, that's a good transition. What's the state with BuzzFeed right now and all these big cash heavy invested like media company? What is the current state?
I mean, most of them a lot of them, the smaller ones kind of like went completely bankrupt and shut down or were bought up for cheap by like private equity, companies. That was like Mike.com. BuzzFeed still exists. It's still a public company, but it's a shell of its former self. It's laid off lots of workers. It had to sell off a lot of its assets. So it's like, it's basically, it faced a major debt crisis that it only narrowly avoided, basically a margin call or whatever it's called. So right now it's basically limping along in a severely reduced state. There was news I just read yesterday that it's trying to launch its own social network so that it could own more of the audience distribution and take some of that power away from the platforms. As I kind of wrote in my note to my paid subscribers, it's like this would have been a great thing to build back in like 2015 when it had all this huge audience
Mm.
and all this cash flow to like build this like social network, which I think is smart. Like you want like. And publishers should always try to invest in owned and operated platforms where they can own the relationship with the audience. But like it's severely undercapitalized now and has a much smaller audience, so it's going to have a harder time building something like that right now. And then in terms of Vice went bankrupt and was sold to an investment firm. It laid off most of its staff. It has like a small core staff, and it's trying to rebuild basically. But it's much smaller than it was at its peak.
Mhm. And do you still have VC investing in media company in the US? Is that still a thing or?
Yeah, but it's a much smaller amount. Like you're no longer seeing these raises of $50 million, $250 million. Usually, if a media company is getting an investment, you see like Semaphore and Puck, and a few others like that. Usually, they're announcing like small seven figure investments, less than $10 million, and that's smart. I think you still could invest in a media company, but you want to have smart, sustainable growth. So, raising just enough to be able to hire a few more journalists or expand into a new vertical or something like that. So, it's much more conservative in how they're raising money and how they're growing.
Got it. In terms of the underrated or overlooked monetization strategies for publishers, what do you personally find the most interesting? We talked about e-com events.
Mhm.
What do you see that maybe is small today, but you're particularly keen on like talking about or following this
Yeah.
trend?
One thing I've noticed is like more investment and really interesting stuff with like proprietary data products. So instead of saying we're launching a paid subscription where we're just giving you access to extra content, it's behind a paywall. They're creating these kind of separate information products so that they're continuing to create free content like they were before, but for a paid subscription you get access to all this specific some like yeah, I'm sure you're aware of Bloomberg, like which has the Bloomberg terminal that costs like $23,000 a year, and that's the main cash cow of Bloomberg. They're doing these in like specific niche industries, and that's what they're trying to basically grow that as like a differentiated information product. Like one example is FreightWaves. It covers the logistics industry, like the movement of freight, and they have like a data product that if you're like a player in the freight industry, you want to have access to this data product so you can see real time prices and stuff like that of what it costs to move products from point A to point B. I've even interviewed like small creators who are building data products. So like one guy I interviewed on my podcast, his name's Simon Carless. He has a newsletter about music marketing video game marketing, and he has a data product where he keeps track of all the different video games that are launching on mobile phones and stuff like that, and how much money they invested in marketing and how much revenue they generated. So if you're launching a video game, you want to access his product so you can figure out all the comps to figure out like what's the best media like marketing strategy I could be using. So I'm starting to see more and more media companies building out these kind of like proprietary information products that are different from what they're doing on the news gathering side.
So it's not necessarily for big media like Bloomberg. You see like creators or smaller publishers that can pull that off and successfully
Yeah. Yeah,
monetize it.
because you're basically you just need someone to do data entry. So a lot of them are like hiring a part-time person whose job it is just to scour, you know, whatever the data they're collecting and just make sure to input that new data on a daily basis. And so a lot of them are finding, hiring someone for like 10 to 20 hours a week is sufficient in order to collect the data to kind of fuel that platform.
Uh, Is that the data basically selling the data as a service? Is that the main for this type of creator or smaller publisher? Is that the main business, or is that
Mhm.
like just a new service and they also sell like a sponsorship or they're doing events as well?
Yeah,
Or
they're usually diversified, and yeah, this is like usually kind of a new business category for them, and it's like a way to kind of make it something that's truly different that isn't already on the marketplace, because a lot of these publishers have competitors that are competing for the same scoops and advertisers and stuff like that. So they're saying this is something different, this is something proprietary, this is something none of my competitors have, and it gives you differentiated value that you don't get just from reading content. Like it's usually a data field that you can manipulate yourself, which
Mhm,
so basically it's you could argue it's a tech company and should
mhm,
be valued for as a tech company basically.
mhm. So that's all well and good for B2B. And it's funny to see that most of the time the innovation actually, at least what I see, and I'm curious to know if for you it's the same, but a lot of innovation in terms of monetization strategies for media are coming from B2B. B2C seems a bit slower to move, or is that harder to put it off?
Well, it's just like B2B just has a lot of advantages of like nicheified and like, kind of protecting themselves from competition. Obviously, B2B, it's easier to convince someone to be a paid subscriber if it helps them with their jobs. That's not to say that there isn't innovation happening, in the B2C space. A lot of that's happening in the creator economy, with YouTubers, podcasters, TikTokers, and stuff like that. But then obviously you have success like, the New York Times, the Guardian, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the information's more kind of B2B. So there is success on the B2C side, but um, obviously there's just a lot more competition.
Mhm. All right. And what do you see in terms of innovation? Is that really a priority for publishers in the US, at least, to really diversify? Is that something that they take seriously, or do they still think like you said that display is not? it's not a winning product going forward, but still we can see a lot of display still. It still
Yeah.
represents huge amount of money for publishers. So do you feel like publishers are still like sitting on display and they think like, oh yeah, we can ride on that wave and we can still make money with display? Or is that like really an urgency in terms of, okay, right now we need new revenue streams?
Yeah. I mean, certainly a lot of publishers give lip service to diversification and moving into these new spaces. I think the problem is with these legacy media companies is they get entrenched in a media model. They become like really used to it and they don't want to let go of that media model. And so even if it's like showing diminishing returns, it's hard to get them out of that mindset of focusing on that and thinking, okay, how do we build like truly new business models? And also, like, you know, a lot of these legacy publishers have diminished resources, so they it's hard. Like if business model A is paying the bills and you don't have a lot of, you know, your profit market is shrinking, you can't necessarily, you know, put much focus on building out business model B, which may be the future, but like, you know, how do you devote resources to it when, you know, business model A is kind of your cash cow at the moment. So especially with local news publishers, like they're just like legacy news, local legacy newspapers are just so like bone thin now in terms of staffing and resources and stuff like that, that it's become almost impossible for them to innovate because they're basically in a death spiral.
All right. So yeah, it's tough. It's really it's a really tough question, but I guess like within all your the conversation that you have like on your podcast and all the media entrepreneurs and operators that you talk to, is there a trend that you see happening that you're particularly like keen of following and that is not requiring a huge like how to say a huge change of the media the media strategy? Is that like collaborating with a new type of media with creators, or is that like launching new verticals? Is there any ways to respond to this question? Because again, it's tough.
So, like, what are ways that media companies can get out of that death spiral? I mean, I
Yes.
do something I've written about a lot in my newsletter is like they need to finally recognize the power of the creator economy and that it's like upending the way that like talent management, you know, works. Like the traditional media company is like a pyramid where you have like the person, you know, the editor up top and the publisher, and it's paying salaries to everybody, and everybody is kind of valued the same, and there are no incentives in place because it's just like the brand is king and the personal brands are kind of toned down basically. And so what we're seeing though is like a lot of those people that were traditionally in the bottom part of the pyramid have built up their own personal brands, and they're realizing like, hey, I'm bringing a lot of value to this media company and I'm not really seeing the returns on that value. So I'm actually going to leave this publication, launch my own publication on like Substack or YouTube or a podcast, and then I'm going to get all the fruits of my labor and all, you know, all the value I bring, and I'm going to make a lot more money doing that. So you've seen this with like Paul Krugman leaving the New York Times, Jim Acosta leaving CNN, Jen Rubin leaving the Washington Post. All these things have happened within the last few weeks because these journalists and columnists realize that they're actual stars and that they can be more successful on the outside of these institutions than in. So how do these institutions, they're bleeding their top talent, what do? They need to completely reorganize the way that they create incentives so that their staff gets rewarded as they start generating more traffic and revenue. And most of those companies are still doing like top down, you know, traditional paying salaries and flat fees and stuff like that. Whereas they should be incentivizing their journalists to create more value because they're going to see, you know, payoff from it. Does that make sense? So like
Yeah,
you think
sure.
of like the book industry.
Hmm.
when you sign a book deal with a major publisher, you're paid a cash advance, and then you get royalties on that book. So once you earn out the advance, you get to benefit in the upside of the book sale. So that incentivizes you to go out there and try to market your book and build a fan base and everything. Same thing with the music industry. You're paid in advance. A record label pays in advance to the musician, and then once they earn that advance, they get to benefit from the upside. But why doesn't the media industry operate like that? And so I think like a lot of the media companies of the future, the ones that are going to be really successful, 10 years down the road, they're going to be the ones that figured out how to kind of reorganize those incentives so that creators can see more of the upside of the value that they're creating for them.
Mhm. Again, it's interesting because it's a model that we can see happening in the B2B space where, for example, there's this media company, media group called Workweek. I think
Work week,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they work with creators that already have an audience, and they're like a collective.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a collective.
Hmm.
Um, do you think it could be happening in the same way for B2C as well, where you create a new media where you incentivize, as you said, like people who already have a following, and you bring them a brand, or do you think it's transferable?
Yeah, totally. And like a lot of these creators, they need the help that a media company that could bring them. So like offering them health insurance, offering them, a base salary, offering them help with terms of finding advertisers and stuff like that, and marketing, audience development. Like I think a lot of creators would be really open to working with media companies because media companies actually can enhance their businesses. So I think like, a B2C company that focuses on fitness or beauty or whatever could like work with like a bunch of influencers and creators within and journalists within that space and help them grow and take like a basically take a share of the revenue that they're creating for them. You're starting to see this already with like podcast networks, creator management, influencer marketing firms. Like they're basically like taking on some of the roles of like a media company and helping them in terms of like marketing and finding sponsors and monetization and stuff like that. So I definitely think it could happen in the B2C space.
Interesting. So we talked about the promising trends of what's going to happen in the futures, but we see a lot of as well sometimes some type of media company following a hype or a trend, and that ends up like being a terrible decision. For example, the pivot to videos when we were talking about BuzzFeed that cost a lot of money for media companies. Maybe was it 10 years ago? I think
Mm-hmm.
where they invested so much money, and basically Facebook then said, "Oh well, we're not going to give you money for that." And well, I'm generalizing, but well, either are there any other trends that you think publishers should be careful of following right now that you think it might be a bit tricky for publishers
Mm-hmm. I
to
mean, I think like what I talked with like the affiliate thing, like they're them kind of just doubling down on just like bad copy. But I think obviously the elephant in the room is just AI. So like I think a lot of publishers are there. Everybody's telling them like AI is the future, and they're all like everybody's like has hired someone in their newsroom whose focus is like how do we integrate AI, and so you're seeing all these publishers that are less scrupulous basically stepping on rakes and just generating just really bad inaccurate content in order because they want to basically scale more quickly with fewer resources. And a lot of them are getting burned. Like every time they do it, they get burned for it. The most recent example is Geo Media, which owns the business site Quartz, like just got caught generating a ton of AI content that was just completely, inaccurate. So I see a lot of publishers talking about wanting to integrate, AI generated content more and more, and I just don't think the quality control is there.
Okay, I see. I've seen an article of a guy using AI to create a network of hyper local media newsletters.
Hmm.
And it was the guy didn't hide from it, and he said yes, it's all AI, and apparently he scraped some email address to add to the list. I'm sure there's a lot of like media group or media entrepreneurs that are doing that, and the goal is to create like a big media corporation or big media empire, just one man and with AI. But right now, I think like it's all really short term. It's all really like okay, you can try, but you're gonna get caught up, or as you said, like it's really AI is definitely a plus, and it's definitely something that publishers should be using. But right now, they're all, at least in France, they're all trying, testing, and looking at the tools available, trying new things. But there's no really case study for it right now that it's a solid ways for publishers to integrate into the strategy like more advanced. Or is that the case with the publishers that you follow in the US as well?
So sorry, what's the question?
The question is more like, yeah, how can you integrate AI as a publisher without without too much risk, I guess, like making it part of the organization, but still trying to publish quality content.
Yeah, I mean, I think like at the end of the day, like humans should be creating the content, like using AI in ways that will speed up like information collection and stuff like that. I think that's where they could maybe use it for value, like let's like combing through Zoom recordings of government meetings and stuff, like things where you don't have a reporter in the room to like have like a tool like Otter AI like quickly go through that meeting and summarize the most important points from it so that they know if there's anything there, or to comb through large data sets and stuff like that looking for trends and stuff, or the simple use of just transcription software. I've certainly gotten a lot of value of that whenever I'm doing reporting. Like I remember when in 2000, the late 2000s, early 2010s, where I was literally taking my recorded interviews and typing them out, which was just so laborious and time consuming. And now you could put it into a transcription service and get a pretty accurate transcription like within a matter of minutes, which is like kind of a huge game changer. So there are ways on like kind of outer edge cases that they could utilize AI, but I think if you're utilizing it to create content, the quality control isn't there. And if the quality control is there, then what's the efficiency? If you have to spend all your time fact checking the content, what efficiency is it really adding? Because you're spending just as much time like doing quality control than it would have been to just have a human write it. So I don't know. I think a lot of this tech is kind of overrated, and they're making claims that aren't like completely true about like the capabilities of the tech. And then a bunch of companies that are lazy and want to cut corners rush out content that isn't ready for prime time, and then they get burned and embarrassed, and then they have to kind of issue apologies and everything like that. So I don't know. I think like publishers should be extremely cautious in terms of how they adopt this technology.
Okay, I see. Well, in terms of innovation, we talked about innovation for monetization, but if we speak more broadly about innovation within the publisher space, within the media industry, I'm curious to know, like, for big publishers, or who is in charge of innovation? Is it like an innovation strategist within the media organization that you follow? And how does that work? Actually, I'm really curious because in France, at least the media I interviewed or I followed, it's a bit of like everyone is like trying to innovate, everyone is contributing, but there's no chief of innovation. Is that something happening in the US?
I mean, I think like the largest media companies, like the New York Times and Condé Nast and stuff like that, probably have someone who's like an actual dedicated team to innovation. But I don't think most publishers have that kind of resources. They just kind of have to try to stay on top of the trends and experiment and stuff like that. I don't know that they have like a chief innovation officer or anything like that.
Hmm. And do you think that would be useful? Do you think like what the broader question maybe behind it is what do you think will save the media industry?
I think one thing I'm noticing is more industry like consolidating their all their monetization strategies under a chief revenue officer, because
Okay.
a lot of these like business arms operated as like separate fiefdoms. So you, like the paid the subscriber consumer revenue side was, basically at war with the advertising side, because obviously when you put a paywall you get less traffic, and then when you get less traffic there's less advertising revenue. So they were kind of at odds with each other, and it was kind of getting in the way of experimentation and real innovation. So I think like one thing you're starting to see is the changing of titles in terms on the business side, so you can consolidate, and there's more clear line of like power and influence, so that there's a chief revenue officer who's looking at all the different aspects of the business at all times. So I think that's probably a bigger trend than media companies hiring chief innovation officers or anything like that.
I see.
I
Interesting.
guess like another thing too is like creating more communication between the newsroom and the business side. Like usually, typically the newsroom is completely walled off. Like,
Hmm.
when I worked at U.S. News and World Report, for instance, back in like 2012, 2013, like we never had a single, like nobody in the newsroom ever had a single conversation with anybody, on the business side. And so the only KPI that we knew of is they wanted more traffic, but they were just selling like shitty, sorry, I don't mean to swear. I don't know if you're allowed to do
It's
that on this
okay.
podcast, but,
Go for it.
um, uh, really, low quality display ads, because the newsroom didn't have a clear KPIs, and they were
Hmm.
creating a lot of low quality content, which wasn't that valuable to advertisers. And so there was no true collaboration between the editorial and the business side. So I think like, a lot of companies are thinking more about like how do we actually educate our journalists about like what value they're bringing and how we measure that value.
Okay. So you see these conversations happening
Yeah, I
between
mean,
the.
certainly more on like the smaller side, where like the more kind of creator economy, kind of independent media side, where their staff is small and they kind of can't afford to like have much differentiation. But like, yeah, like you're seeing like Work Week, like Puck and stuff like that, where the journalists like, I think I don't know exactly how their deals are hammered out, but like at Puck, which is a subscription publication, their individual journalists, they get like upside rewards whenever someone converts into a paid subscriber while trying to read their content. So there's like a very direct line between the value they're creating and what they're getting paid. So I think a lot of more media models like that. We're going to see more and more of those in the next like decade or so.
Got it. Interesting. Before going into the ending questions, are you optimistic about how most media are monetizing their audience in 2025 and beyond? Are you optimistic about the media industry in general?
Yeah, and but the reason I'm optimistic about the media industry is because I have a very broad definition of what media is. Like when you say media, most people think like newspapers, broadcasters, like the BBC or CNN, or traditional magazines. Like I don't think like that sector of the media is going to do that well. Like there will be some winners, like the New York Times and stuff like that, but I think a lot of those will continue to hurt. But when you create this like much broader view of media to being anything with like information services or content, including like non-traditional publishers, like companies that are create like consumer products and stuff that have like a media arm attached to it, I think like the media ecosystem is just going to get richer, and we're going to find more and more business models. Like one of the exciting things in the creator economy is like how many of these creators are just launching products that aren't that you wouldn't even think of as media
Mhm.
products, like
Mhm.
Mr. Beast with his like chocolate feastables brand, like Emma Chamberlain with her coffee brand, but even like smaller like fitness influencers that are selling their own like whey proteins and other fitness products and stuff like that, or you know like food influencers who are selling their own ingredients
Mhm.
and cooking utensils and stuff like that. I think that's really exciting part of the media sector, where they're just completely thinking outside of the box and not even bothering with advertising and subscriptions, which are usually the backbone of any traditional
Right.
media company.
So it looks like you're really excited to follow that, but do traditional or legacy media are excited about that, or they like scared about it?
They're scared because it's like it's not something that they know. Like they don't know how to create products. They don't know how the supply chain works. I was just writing in my newsletter about Mr. Beast, where I was watching this interview with him, and it's clear that he's not just slapping his name onto a chocolate brand. Like he knows every aspect of the supply chain. He knows exactly how his products end up in Walmart and how they are displayed on shelves and if you have the product on this shelf for this versus this shelf, how those two different products will. And he knows about like sourcing chocolate from some East African countries and which ones use child labor and stuff like that. So like that's really scary for publishers to basically build that entire knowledge base
Mm,
that they don't currently have.
right. Interesting. If you have time for the ending question, 10 minutes,
Sure.
it's okay for you? Okay, great.
Yeah.
As a media entrepreneur and journalist, what is the tool or service that you wish you had for your job that doesn't exist yet, that you dream of having?
What is the what service? Sorry.
The tool or service, it could be anything that basically will help you in your day to day.
Whew. Uh, the tool or service that would help me in my day to day. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know what the exact tool or service is, but I can tell you the weak spots in my business
Right.
that, and like for instance, I mainly like do monetize through like subscriptions and consulting right now because that like fits into my strength, and I don't like really have access to like a lot of other creators in my niche like are making a lot of money through selling sponsorships and stuff like that, and I just don't really have that. I don't have a sales background and stuff like that, so tools or services that make it easier to find sponsors and to communicate the value proposition and stuff like that. There are like a few on the market, like some newsletter ad sales platforms and stuff like that, but they don't really generate much demand right now in the way that like YouTube generates huge demand for advertising that it shares with creators. So I guess that's one pain point for me, but I don't have like a specific tool in mind that I think
Right.
could
Okay.
could fix that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else
Mhm.
that that I
But
would that I would want.
but the monetization for sponsor for podcast or newsletter is interesting because it could be like the most obvious ways for podcaster or newsletter operator to monetize, but sometimes it's not the most exciting things as well. And if you don't have the sales background, and it's a lot of it's painful to find sponsors to make sure they're aligned with your brand, with your content.
Mhm.
That's something I hear a lot as well. But have you considered joining like podcast network as you talked about earlier?
I mean, a lot of those networks have like a minimum threshold, and I think I have a great audience, a very valuable audience, but like a lot of those networks won't talk to you unless you have 50,000 downloads per episode, and I'm just nowhere near in that
Mm.
space. I have talked to various people about selling ads in my newsletter and podcast on like a commission basis, a lot of them will say yes and be like, yeah, I'll sell ads and I'll get a commission. But it's really hard to incentivize people to work on commission only. They get all fired up, but then when it's time to roll up their sleeves and actually go out there and do the selling, all of a sudden they get bored and stop going. So I think basically I'll have to get to a point with subscriptions where I'm generating enough revenue so I can set aside some revenue to pay like some monthly retainer to an ad salesperson so that they're more incentivized. So like it would be structured like basically a monthly payment of a few $1,000s and then they get commission on top of that. And I think that'll be the only way that I can get someone seriously working on selling ads for my newsletter and podcast.
Okay, cool. We already talked a lot about trends, so feel free to skip this question if nothing comes out of this the question I'm going to ask. The trends in the media industry that you're most exciting about. It feels like you're really into like creator economy. The way you talk
Yeah.
about Mr. Beast, for example, it
Yeah.
looks like it's
I mean,
really
that is the most exciting part. I think is like these new business models that are emerging, and like creators become or like media entrepreneurs becoming kind of like the kind of layer for marketing for those products. Like the great thing about these media companies is they're basically when they create their own products, they're like lowering their customer acquisition costs because they don't have to spend money on marketing because they already have the audience that they can market it to. So that's why a lot of these creator businesses like have a lot of potential. So that's really exciting. I also think like what excites me is like as the creator economy matures, like how it'll start merging with traditional media, and especially Hollywood. Like, I think, the more this is something I've written about is like the more revenue that YouTube generates for creators, the more they're able to invest in production costs. And now you have creators who have budgets of hundreds of thousands of dollars per video. So and that's getting closer and closer to the budgets for per episode for like traditional like reality TV shows and stuff like that. So these two sides are getting closer and closer together, and eventually they're just going to start bleeding into each other. And like YouTube will be just as high quality, like some YouTube channels will be just as high in quality as like the top TV shows. So like my kind of thought experiment is like when's the first like hit narrative show like the next Breaking Bad. I don't know if you know these TV shows, they're American TV shows, but like Breaking Bad or Mad Men or Game of Thrones, when's the first one of those going to like launch natively on YouTube? That'll be like a really
yeah,
exciting time.
for sure that will be exciting. Yeah, it's true that we haven't seen that happening yet, but yeah, something to worth following for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, what are, on the opposite side of the question? What are the thing that raised the most questions for you in the media industry? What worries you as an expert of the media industry?
I get like really perturbed that like companies like Meta can continue to be really successful because they don't share revenue with creators. Like a company like Meta, TikTok, Snapchat, a few others, they collectively generate like north of 150 billion dollars a year in revenue, and creators just keep on giving them all their free content. And I want to see the platform succeed, or the ones that are sharing revenue with creators. Substack, YouTube, Spotify. Like these are companies that share a major like percentage of their revenue with their creators, and I would like those companies to benefit from those incentives so that they attract the creators away from Meta, and then allow them to start generating more revenue, and then hopefully if Meta starts losing enough creators, that will force them to start sharing revenue with those creators so they can keep those creators on their platforms. And so I think it is really worrying that like a company like Meta, and to a certain extent some smaller platforms, are profiting so much off the back of creators and yet not sharing the spoils with those creators.
Hmm. And do
So
you
I
see?
would love for there to be a revolution where creators like basically stop posting to meta platforms, or only post like their lower quality content, and save all their really high quality content for the platforms that are actually sharing revenue with them.
Interesting. Is there a media or a media group that inspire you a lot that you really like to follow and report on?
Yeah, I really love Puck. I've written about them like several times. It's like a way that like they really figured out, how to merge the best of traditional media and the creator economy, by, assembling these like star journalists together and giving them incentives to all help the company succeed. So that's definitely one. I mean, there's tons of examples. Like, all I do every day is interviewing media entrepreneurs. So there are just so many. It's hard to even like name, some favorites that are doing just like really interesting stuff.
Right. Okay, but I'll
Yeah.
put Puck in the description of the podcast because it is an interesting media for sure.
Yeah.
So, well, you just said that you interview thousands of entrepreneurs in the media industry. You already have your podcast, your newsletter. But is there any media business that you would like to launch in the few in the coming years
A
that you
media,
dream of launching
a
a
media
media
a
business?
media yeah, I mean, so one of the things I kind of talk about, with my spouse and a few others, is like I kind of fell into the niche that I am now because of just like the circumstances that surrounded me as I was kind of coming into my career and growing up, like at a time when all this new media was emerging. And there is part of me that would love to like sell my business or close down my business and launch into another niche or vertical. And so I'm not focusing on, media and the creator economy. Like I have other interests. I'm really interested in like green energy, green tech,
Okay.
like, fitness stuff. I also just want to like, I miss like long form reporting. Like the thing that like made me fall in love in journalism in the first place was reading like, 10,000 word articles in the New Yorker. Like I would love to like do some other things sometime in the future. I don't know how far off that is, but I would, I don't necessarily want to be doing what I do now for the rest of my career. Like I always want to be in media. I always want to be creating content, but like this isn't necessarily the only kind of content that I want to be creating for the rest of my career.
I see. So potentially you're interested into other industries, but right now, what's taking you the most time? The podcast, the newsletter, or both equally? It's because it's a ton of work. People don't
Yeah.
realize, but running a podcast, like booking the guests, trying to get
Yeah.
interesting topics, and for the newsletter as well. Your newsletter really thorough. So
Yeah. I would say it's like 70-30 or 60-40, more time on the newsletter than the podcast.
mhm.
But I spend a lot of time, vetting guests, getting on pre-interviews with the guest, and then the interviews themselves, and then the production, the editing of the video and the audio and the uploads and stuff like that. So all together, that takes like, maybe 2 days of the week. And then the newsletter probably takes like 3 days of the week,
Mm,
maybe. I
okay.
would say 70-30. So
Mhm.
70% of my time on the newsletter, 30% on the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll put all the links in the description because again, you have like such an interesting podcast where you interview guests that you don't see anywhere else, especially in the creator side. So I
Yeah.
think it's a great values for publishers wherever they are, like in France, in the US, in Asia, to get a feel, like to get the pulse of what's happening in the US,
Hmm.
which often is like the market where innovation comes from. Are you looking for like partners in Europe or in the, or are you looking for contact?
Yeah.
If you have a call to make for my audience.
What I'm looking for. I mean,
Mm,
one of my dreams is like I'd love to like find someone who maybe has like a similar business to mine who wants to like team up and scale and like maybe launch some kind of joint venture together, like probably like a podcast slash YouTube show where
mhm,
like right now my podcast and YouTube is focused on just interviewing media entrepreneurs, like long form interviews like that. But I would love to have like a co-host, maybe where we launch like some kind of separate podcast together and we just discuss trends in media, kind of like what I do in the newsletter currently. So um, I haven't really put a call out for that or like
right.
approached anybody for that, but like just because I'm just so busy with everything else, but like
Mhm,
being able to cross pollinate and kind of like grow a business together with someone else that's maybe separate from my main core
right.
business. I think I could drive a lot of synergies with somebody who if somebody is out there who wants to do something like that.
Sounds good. Sounds very interesting. And what's the best way for listeners to get in touch with you? Is that LinkedIn or?
No, I mean they should just go to my newsletter or sign up for like on my about page. On all my platforms, I have my email address, simonowens@gmail.com. So all like people try to DM me on LinkedIn or some other platform and want to like get on the phone with me. And I'm always like, I always say the same thing. Can you shoot me an email? Because that's
That's
the
true.
best way that I I think even maybe you reached out
Yes.
to me and
Yes,
and
I'm remembering.
you were like, hey, do you want to come on my podcast? I was like, sure, but shoot me an email. That will vastly increase your chances of
Sure.
me coming on the podcast.
I
So yeah,
trust.
always email me. If you DM me on a social media platform, your chances are much lower of me responding.
Okay, great. Okay, Simon, thank you so much for your time, your
Yeah.
expertise, and yeah, thank you. It was really insightful, and you're the first international guest on my podcast, so I really appreciate you to take the time and yeah, to have this chat today. Thank you so
I,
much.
I'm honored to be your first international guest.
Thank you. Bye bye, Simon.
Bye.